All right, well, last but not least, we will be looking at Module 51. We've got quite a bit of ground to cover, actually, and one of these I probably will spend a little bit more time in class, but dissociative disorders, which I will do a little bit of explaining for the background, and I'll review again in class. Dissociative personality disorders, which I mentioned briefly when I was talking about the DSM-4, and then finally eating disorders. And it's a little bit hard to jump into and help you to understand dissociative disorders. Let me just mention, first of all, we'll start with that one first. Dissociative disorders are the way to understand these is understanding and thinking about time and how we process time. And I may have to take a number of slides to actually walk through each one of these, but essentially in dissociative disorders, a person appears to experience a sudden loss of memory or change in identity, and usually it's in response to an overwhelmingly stressful situation. And like I said, the way to think about dissociative disorders is really in terms of a continuum of time. And when you get up in the morning, and let's just say that here I were to ask you, what did you spend your time doing during this time? You would have little markers along the way that you'd be able to tell me what happened during this time. And you'd use your memory and tell me what you had for breakfast or who you ate with or whatever. And that's more typical of most of us. It's fairly continuous, a continuous understanding of time itself. In the most dramatic cases, which is DID, dissociative identity disorder, you have, if you were to think about time, you would have a wakefulness time. You'd be able to tell me what you were doing at, say, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But then what would happen is during a long, protracted period of time, you would have no memory. It would be blacked out. The next time you might awake, if you want to call it that, would be 8 p.m., and someone were to say, what did you just do? And most of the time, they would say, the person who is DID would say, well, I was doing the same thing I was doing at 1 o'clock. So they essentially take this period of time and they fill it. That doesn't mean that that's true. So there's this big gap in time that occurs, and in MPD world, it's referred to as the loss of time. They don't know what they did during that time, and usually during this time, an alternate identity was active. And it used to be that we referred to it as alternate personality. And identity itself basically has not only a range of emotions. There are 3 component parts here. Range let me put it in, range of emotion. They have a depth of emotion. And they have a unique behavioral history. Oops. Behavioral history. Remember, HX is just a shortened term for history. So essentially, during this period of time, they were active in doing things. If somebody were to look at them, they wouldn't see any big differences. But essentially, it would be an alternate identity that was operational during that time. How do they become this way? As the definition I just gave you, in response to an overwhelmingly stressful situation, is tame. Probably 9 98.5 out of 10, which is not really a number, but 95%, 97% have traumatic, chronic, over a period of years, and horrific abuse that triggers this. Now, let's go back to our timelines up here. You can also think of dissociation, and let me create another timeline for you, is dissociation. And dissociation itself is not pathological, okay? If you were to think of it along a continuum, there's a long period, if you will, or a long part of this continuum that would all fall within the range of normal. A good example would be daydreaming. Another example would be highway hypnosis. These are not pathological, they are naturally occurring, and dissociation is a natural occurrence. What happens in where we cross into from normal to abnormal is when it begins to, remember the 3 Ds, be deviant. They might engage in violent acts. It's distressing, and it's dysfunctional. And that's where we are with dissociative disorders. We have something we refer to as an amnestic disorder, which is amnesia. They lose their sense of identity, and they don't know who they are. It's not based on a knock on the head, unlike Hollywood would have us believe. So that's one. Another one is what we call amnestic fugue. So the person leaves and travels to another location under a new identity. It is not intentional. It is not creating and trying to hide. It's not like the witness protection program where you're given a new identity. This occurs spontaneously, and the person leaves the situation. We have dissociative identity disorder, which that is the most severe, relatively rare. And then you have other pain disorders and things in that category that fall into dissociative disorder. So we have a variety of ones that we see within the dissociative disorders, and DID is probably the one that's the most famous might be a better word. Amnestic dissociative disorder, fugue, and DID are just 3 of them that fall into this category. And DID in the Christian realm oftentimes is questioned as or looked at as demon possession, and I can tell you that in some cases it is, but in other cases it isn't, and then it's misdiagnosed and the person experiences some fairly traumatic experiences at the hands of well-meaning people, Christians specifically, that fall into trying to cast out a identity / personality and comes into play. Now let me give you a few more terms for you to understand, and I think I've got enough room. I'm just going to carve out a little place over here. One of the terms of DID is alters, and this just simply refers to other personalities. And another term that's important is the executive personality. This is really the one that handles everything external, the external world and so forth. The loss of time, already mentioned. How do they go from one personality to another? Another term we use is that they switch. If I could spell switch, that would be helpful. So they'll switch from one to another. Sometimes we refer to it as a swoon switch. So their head kind of drops like they're swooning, and then they come back up and they're another personality altogether. So those are a few other terms. I'll explain more in class so you can have a better understanding of how this all works. Now, let's turn our attention to personality disorders.